Later this morning, the Constitutional Court will make its judgment on the decision of the Electoral Independent Commission, that's the IEC, to reopen the municipal election candidate nomination registration system in terms of the Constitutional Court order not to postpone the 1st of November elections. Now, this comes after the Democratic Alliance filed an urgent legal application against the IEC after the system was closed in August with more than 59,000 candidates being captured. To give us more information on the implication of today's Constitutional Court ruling on the municipal elections, we are joined by Lawson Naidoo, Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution. Lawson, good to have you. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Leanne. Thank you for having me on.
Right, so on Saturday, the Constitutional Court delivered its reasons for the 3rd of September court ruling not to postpone this year's municipal elections. How important is this judgment to today's ruling on the DA against the IEC matter?
Well, firstly, the reasons that were provided on Saturday evening for the order that the court issued earlier this month make it clear that it was not permissible to extend the municipal elections beyond the illegally mandated period, which the cutoff of which is the 1st of November. And we now expect that the minister will gazette the 1st of November as the election date sometime later today. But previously, when the minister had gazetted the 27th of October as the date, the IEC then put in place a timetable, which they do for every election, in terms of the closure of the voters' roll and a number of other logistical steps that need to be taken in order to enable them to prepare adequately for an election on the election day itself. And that included the fact that, as you say, the candidate nomination process concluded, I think, on the 23rd of August. We know that the ANC, as well as a few others, missed the deadline to submit a full list of candidates by that time. The ANC then said that it was going to take the matter to court, in fact, lodged papers in order to reopen that candidate nomination process. But the IEC stood firm because this has occurred previously, once before, I think in 2016 with the NFP. And the IEC said, no, our hands are tied, we can't reopen. And on that basis, the IEC took a firm line and the ANC withdrew its application. So we now brings us to this judgment, which on Saturday, which allows the date of the election to be changed, and as a result of which, and the fact that the voters' roll has been reopened. We know we had a registration weekend this past weekend, and that voters' roll is now closed. And the IEC's argument is that there's a direct link between the voters' roll and the candidate nomination process.
Yeah.
And the reason, Leanne, being that the Constitution in Section 19 directly links the right to vote with the right to stand for public office. The two rights are inextricably linked. And the IEC view is that once you've reopened the voters' roll, expanded that voters' roll, and allowed people to change the wards in which they vote, it necessarily follows that the candidate nomination process must be reopened, because the pool of eligible candidates will have been increased.
Okay. So, in your opinion, in your view, do you think that this is reason enough for the IEC to do exactly what they intend on doing, is opening that registration list? I mean, the reasons that you've given, they almost sound like, you know, this might be a no-go zone for the DA and they might not have any success in this. But perhaps you can give us from, you know, CASAC's point of view, what do you believe the chances are for the DA with the IEC's reasoning?
I think the DA's chances are extremely slim, Leanne. Firstly, I think it's a restrictive interpretation of Saturday's judgment to say that the fact that the court ordered the voter registration process to be reopened, it does not permit the Electoral Commission from reopening the candidate nomination process, is a far too restrictive interpretation of the court order, and impinges on the authority of the Commission, which, let us not forget, is a Chapter 9 institution, an independent body, to carry out its electoral management functions in the best way that it sees possible. We know that they're operating within a truncated timetable because of the peculiar circumstances we find ourselves in at the moment. And they've got to make the best of that process. So the Saturday order doesn't, I don't think, assist the DA. Secondly, the Electoral Management Act makes it very clear, explicitly so, that within an electoral process, if the date of the election is changed, as it will be now, to the 1st of November, then the IEC has, in terms of the Electoral Management Act, has the express power to amend the timetable to suit that new date. With the voters' roll having closed, as I said, at midnight last night, the IEC is within its power and authority to change the candidate registration date.
Yeah, yeah.
There's a further important point, Leanne, is that after the court order was handed down on the 3rd of September, the Electoral Commission held a meeting with what is called the National Party Liaison Committee, which is the representatives of all the political parties in the National Assembly. And in that meeting, 10 of the 14 parties that are represented there agreed with the IEC that the candidate nomination process should be reopened. So this was not the IEC going out on a whim of its own, as some have suggested, in order to benefit the ANC.
Yeah.
10 of the 14 parties agreed with them that it was the right thing to do.
Yeah, yeah. Very, very interesting. I mean, you're really giving us some great analysis here in terms of the weight behind this. What the Court has said, though, and it has confirmed that the matter will be decided on papers without an oral hearing. What could have brought about this decision?
Well, firstly, I think it's because the matter is relatively simple one for the court to determine. As I say, the Democratic Alliance, I think, are on very weak ground here. So I think in the light of the reasons provided on Saturday in the earlier judgment, as well as the arguments that are presented on paper, that the court feels that it has sufficient information in front of it in order to issue a judgment or an order later this morning. And it doesn't require the benefit of oral argument in order to do that. The issues, I think, are relatively clear. As I've said, Leanne, I think the Electoral Management Act certainly comes to the aid of the Electoral Commission in providing that they have the authority to do what they are seeking to do, which is to reopen the candidate nomination process.
Yeah, I mean, you've given us, your sort of Casack's view on the likelihood of the DA actually succeeding in this. But let's perhaps talk to the fact that of the intention behind this, and if they do, in fact, get this and are successful. I mean, the judgment could basically mean that the ANC might not be able to contest in 13 municipalities, because that's what's at play here, giving other parties, such as the DA, more support in those municipalities, obviously. Do you think the DA is looking out for itself or the actual constitution in challenging the IEC decision to reopen the candidates list registration system?
Well, I think the DA, Leanne, would argue that they are doing both. And they've made it clear in their court papers that they would be prejudiced if the candidate nomination process were to be reopened, because they've earmarked their electoral strategy on the failure of the ANC to register candidates in a number of municipalities, where they feel that the absence of the ANC would allow them to succeed in those places. And they've thrown resources and effort into those areas. So it's clearly a political issue for the DA as well. And I think this is the importance of having an independent electoral management body such as the Electoral Commission, because they've got to mediate these elections are inherently highly contested issues, and you need an independent referee in that process. And that's the role that the IEC plays. Mm-hmm. And, they've done so remarkably well for 27 years since our democracy. We've had several free and fair elections over 27 years with no results being contested, and the integrity and the impartiality of the IEC intact. Now, which is not to say that the IEC is beyond any criticism. They certainly, do fall short of the mark on occasion, but not to the extent that compromises their independence or the freeness and fairness of our electoral results.
Interesting point here. Now, I mean, let's again, should the court rule against the DA's court challenge and give the IEC the go-ahead to reopen the candidate registration process? We've seen in the past that other parties, they didn't get this right. But if, in fact, the ANC do get this right and the IEC are able to open it up, I mean, I suppose the question needs to be asked, what constitutional precedent could this set for future elections?
Well, highly unlikely to set a precedent, Leanne, because of the circumstances here. An election date had been promulgated by the minister, the 27th of October. It was then challenged by the IEC, and they didn't get the extension that they wanted till February next year. And important to note that even in the minority judgment that Acting Chief Justice Zondo penned on Saturday, he would not have granted the IEC the remedy that they sought, which was an extension to February next year. He said that they needed to reopen the voters' roll, hold a registration weekend, but that the election should be done by the 10th of December. So even the minority judgment didn't give the extension. So I think the circumstances that we're dealing with here are unique, with a change of electoral date once it's been promulgated. And as I've said, Leanne, that change of electoral date kicks in certain provisions of the Electoral Management Act, which gives the IEC the authority to amend the timetable. Because obviously, if once an electoral process is started, and the IEC normally needs about 3 months in order to plan all of this logistical steps of voters' roll, candidate lists, checking the voters' roll, printing the ballot papers, printing the relevant segments of the voters' roll to go to each of the voting stations. These are detailed technical processes.
Yeah.
And here we're operating within a very truncated time, because we now have, 6 weeks before the election date, and all of the stuff that would normally take 2 months or more is being truncated. So the IEC needs to be allowed a level of flexibility in order to meet that ultimate deadline that we're all ready to go to the polls on the 1st of November.
Indeed. And of course, today, tomorrow, that's when the parties, obviously the ruling aside, I mean, but what the IEC have basically said is that the new candidate registration date is the 20th and the 21st of September, which is today, tomorrow. So it should be interesting to see, how that goes. And hopefully, on a side note, the ANC gets it right this time. I don't know. Let's see what happens. But just
no guarantees.
No guarantees, exactly. So let's see what comes out. But just as we close, and very quickly, I've got to wrap the interview. The one important thing that the IEC did say is that if the DA is successful in this bid, the feeling is that political parties micromanage them, and this is something that they are concerned about. Is this a legitimate concern, or isn't that not the job to be watched very, very closely?
Well, the IEC must be watched very closely, Leanne. As I've said earlier, they're an independent institution. They've got to be held to a very high standard. But whether it's appropriate for political parties to seek to micromanage how the Commission conducts elections, can't be a good idea. Political parties have a vested interest in electoral processes and outcomes. And that's why we have an independent institution doing this. And like I've said, they consult with political parties, they seek consensus insofar as is possible with managing elections. And in this case, 10 of the 14 parties agreed with the IEC. So can, 4 parties change that decision that the IEC has taken, supported by so many other political parties. So I think it's important that we put front and center of all of this the authority of the Electoral Commission to run and manage what we hope will ultimately be free and fair elections, as well as within the context of a pandemic, a safe election on the 1st of November.
All right. Lawson, thank you. Always a pleasure speaking to you. Thanks so much, Lawson Naidoo, Executive Secretary of the Council for the Advancement of the South African Constitution, talking to us of what to expect from this morning's Constitutional Court ruling brought by the DA against the IEC's decision to reopen the election candidate list registration process. Quick break, news at 7 to follow.